the opportunity to set the record straight, to clear my name. Jules Halpin smiled cordially at me as I sat down in the witness stand. He established eye contact, quickly looked over at the jury, then turned back to me. His dark eyes radiated intelligence, and it seemed an incredible waste that he was working for Schaefer. I want to start by saying that it is an honor to meet you, Detective Cross. For years, I, like most of the jurors, I'm sure, have read in the Washington papers about the murder cases that you have helped solve. We admire your past record. I nodded and even managed a grudging smile of my own. Thank you. I hope you'll admire my present and future record as well, I said. Let's hope so, Detective, Halpin said. He moved on. We parried for half an hour or so before he asked, You suffered a terrible personal tragedy a short time before the arrest of Colonel Schaefer. Could you tell us about it? I fought the urge to reach out and grab the polite-sounding, insidious little man by the neck. I leaned closer to the mic, struggled for control. Someone dear to me was kidnapped while we were in Bermuda on vacation. She's still missing. I haven't given up hope that she'll be found. I pray every day that she's still alive. Halpin clucked sympathetically. He was good, much like his client. I really am sorry. Did the department give you adequate time off? They were understanding and helpful, I said, feeling my jaw stiffen with resentment. I hated that Halpin was using what had happened to Christine to unsettle me. Detective, were you officially back on active duty at the time of Detective Hampton's murder? Yes, I went back on full-time duty about a week before the murder. Was it requested that you stay off active duty for a while longer? It was left up to me. The chief of detectives did question my ability to resume my duties, but he made it my choice. Halpin nodded thoughtfully. He felt your head might be elsewhere. Who could blame you if it was? I was upset. I still am, but I've been able to work. It's been good for me, the right thing to do. There were several more questions about my state of mind. Then Halpin asked, When you found out that Detective Hampton had been murdered, how upset were you? I did my job. It was a bad homicide scene. I wanted to say, Your client is a butcher. Do you really want him to get off? Do you realize what you're doing? Your fingerprints were on Detective Hampton's belt and on the dashboard of her car. Her blood was on your clothes. I paused for several seconds before I spoke again. Then I tried to explain. There was a huge, jagged tear in Detective Hampton's jugular vein. Blood was everywhere in the car, and even on the cement floor of the garage. I tried to help Detective Hampton until I was certain she was dead. That's why my fingerprints were in the car, and Detective Hampton's blood was on my clothes. You tracked blood upstairs? No, I did not. I checked my shoes carefully before I left the garage. I checked twice. I checked because I didn't want to track any blood up into the building. But you were upset. You admit that much. A police officer had been murdered. You forgot to put on gloves when you first searched the scene. There was blood on your clothes. How can you possibly be so sure? I stared directly into his eyes and tried to be as calm as he was. I know exactly what happened that night. I know who killed Patsy Hampton in cold blood. Halpin raised his voice suddenly. No, you do not, sir. That is the point. You do not. In frisking Colonel Jeffrey Schaefer, isn't it fair to say that you were in physical contact with him? Yes. And isn't it possible that blood from your clothes got onto his? Isn't it even likely? I wouldn't give him an inch. I couldn't. No, it isn't possible. That blood was on Jeffrey Schaefer's trousers before I arrived. Halpin moved away from me. He wanted me to sweat. He walked over to the jury box, occasionally looking back at me. He asked several more questions about the crime scene and then said, But Dr. Cassidy didn't see any blood, and the two other officers didn't see any blood either. Not until after you came into contact with Colonel Schaefer. Colonel Schaefer was on the phone except for 3 to 5 minutes before he met with his therapist. He went straight there from his children's birthday party. You have no evidence, Detective Cross, except what you brought into Dr. Cassidy's apartment yourself. You have absolutely no evidence, Detective. You arrested the wrong man. You framed an innocent man. Jules Halpin threw up his hands in disgust. I have absolutely no further questions. I took a back way out of the courthouse. I usually did that anyway, but on this day it was essential. I had to avoid the crowds and the press. I needed to have a private moment to recover from my time on the witness stand. I'd just had my ass pretty well kicked by an expert ass-kicker. Tomorrow, Kathy Fitzgibbon would try to undo some of the damage in cross-exam. I was in no hurry as I walked down a back stairway that was used by maintenance and cleaning people in the building. and also served as a fire escape. It was becoming clear to me that there was a chance Jeffrey Schaefer would be acquitted. His lawyers were the best, and we'd lost important evidence at the suppression hearing. And I had made a bad mistake at the homicide scene, when in my rush to help Patsy Hampton, I neglected to put on gloves. It was an honest mistake, but it probably created doubts in the minds of the jurors. I had more blood on me than Schaefer. That was true. Schaefer might actually get away with murder, and I couldn't stand the thought. The trial was almost over, and now came the really hard part, waiting for the verdict. That Tuesday, the jurors retired to the jury room to commence their deliberations in the murder trial of Jeffrey Schaefer. For the first time, I allowed myself to actually think the unthinkable, that Schaefer might be set free. Sampson and I sat in the rear row of the courtroom and watched the 12 members depart, 8 men and 4 women. John had come to court several times, calling it the best and sleaziest show this side of the Oval Office, but I knew he was there to give me support. "The son of a bitch is guilty. He's mad as little Davy Berkowitz," Sampson said as he watched Schaefer. "But he has a lot of good actors on his side. Doting wife, doting mistress, well-paid lawyers. He could get away with it." It happens, I agreed. Juries are hard to read, and getting harder. I watched as Schaefer courteously shook hands with the members of his defense team. Jules and Jane Halpern both had forced smiles on their faces. They know, don't they? Their client is the Weasel, a mass murderer. Jeffrey Schaefer has the ability to make people believe in him when he needs to. "He's the best actor I've seen," I said. Then John left, and I snuck out the back way. I drove around Washington, riding in gently aimless circles. I finally reached home more than 2.5 hours after leaving the courthouse. Nana came running out of the house. She must have seen me pull into the driveway. She'd obviously been waiting for me. I leaned out of the driver's side window. The DJ was still talking congenially on public radio. "What is it, old woman? What's the matter now?" I asked Nana. "Miss Fitzgibbon called you, Alex. The jury is coming back. They have a verdict." I backed out of the driveway and sped downtown. I got back to the courthouse in less than 15 minutes. The crowd on E Street was even larger and more unruly than it had been at the height of the trial. At least a half-dozen Union Jacks waved in the wind. Contrasting with them were American flags, including some painted across bare chests and faces. I had to push and literally inch my way through the crush of people up close to the courthouse steps. I ignored every question from the press. I tried to avoid anyone with a camera in hand or the hungry look of a reporter. I entered the packed courtroom just before the jury filed back inside. "You almost missed it," I said to myself. Judge Fesco spoke to the crowd as soon as everybody was seated. "There will be no demonstrations when this verdict is read. If any demonstrations occur, marshals will clear this room immediately," he instructed in a soft but clear voice. I stood a few rows behind the prosecution team and tried to find a regular breathing pattern. It was inconceivable that Jeffrey Schaefer could be set free. There was no doubt in my mind that he'd murdered several people, not just Patsy Hampton, but at least some of the Jane Does as well. He was a wanton pattern killer, one of the worst, and had been getting away with it for years. I realized now that Schaefer might be the most outrageous and daring of all the killers I'd faced. He played his game with the pedal pressed to the floor. He absolutely refused to lose. "Mr. Foreman, do you have a verdict for us?" Judge Fesco asked in somber tones. Raymond Horton, the foreman, replied, "Your Honor, we have a verdict." I glanced over at Schaefer. He appeared confident, as he had since the trial began. He was dressed today in a tailored suit, white shirt and tie. He had no conscience whatsoever. He had no fear of anything that might happen to him. Maybe that was a partial explanation for why he'd run free for so long. Judge Fesco looked unusually stern. "Very well. Will the defendant please rise?" Jeffrey Schaefer stood at the defense table. His longish blonde hair gleamed under the bright overhead lighting. He towered over Jules Halpern and his daughter, Jane. Schaefer held his hands behind him, as if he were cuffed. Judge Fesco addressed the foreman again. "As to count 1 of the indictment, aggravated premeditated murder in the first degree, how do you find?" The foreman, "Not guilty, Your Honor. I felt as if my head had suddenly spun off. The audience packed into the small room went completely wild. The press rushed to the bar. The judge had promised to clear the room, but he was already retreating to his chambers. I saw Schaefer walk toward the press, and he quickly passed them by. What was he doing now? He noticed a man in the crowd and nodded stiffly in his direction. Who was that? Then Schaefer continued toward where I was in the fourth row. I wanted to vault over the chairs after him. I wanted him so bad, and I knew I had just lost my chance to do it the right way.
Detective Cross?
He said in his usual supercilious manner.
Detective Cross, there's something I want to say. I've been holding it in for months.
The press closed in. The scene was becoming smothering and claustrophobic. Cameras flashed on all sides. Now that the trial had ended, there was nothing to prevent picture-taking inside the courtroom. Schaefer was aware of the rare photo opportunity. Of course he was. He spoke again, so that everyone gathered around us could hear. It was suddenly quiet where we stood, a pocket of silence and foreboding expectation.
You killed her,
he said, and stared deeply into my eyes, almost at the back of my skull.
You killed her.
I went numb. My legs were suddenly weak. I knew he didn't mean Patsy Hampton. He meant Christine. She was dead. Jeffrey Schaefer had killed her. He had taken everything from me, just as he had warned me he would. He had won.
Schaefer was a free man, and he was enjoying the bloody hell out of it. He'd wagered his life, he had gambled, and he had won big time, big time. He had never felt anything quite like this exhilarating moment following the verdict. Schaefer accompanied Lucy and the children to a by-invitation-only press conference held in the pompous, high-ceilinged grand jury room. He posed for countless photos with his family. All of them hugged him again, and Lucy couldn't stop crying like the brain-dead, hopelessly spoiled and crazy child she was. After the press conference, claiming concern for their safety, he sent his wife and children ahead without him. He stayed behind in the court law library and firmed up book deal details with Jules Halpern and representatives from the Bertelsmann Group, now the most powerful book publishing conglomerate in the world. He had assured them that they would get his story, but of course they weren't going to get anything close to the truth. Wasn't that the way with the so-called tell-all, bear-all non-fiction published these days? The Bertelsmann people knew this, and still they'd paid him dearly. After the meeting, he took the slow-riding lift down to the court's indoor car park. He was still feeling incredibly high, which could be dangerous. A set of 20-sided dice was burning a hole in the pocket of his suit trousers. He desperately wanted to play the game, now. The Four Horsemen, or better yet, Solipsis, his version of the game. He wouldn't give in to that urge, though, not yet. It was too dangerous even for him. Since the beginning of the trial, he had been parking the Jaguar in the same spot. He did have his patterns, after all. He'd never bothered to put coins in the meter, not once. Every day there was a pile of $5 tickets under the windshield wiper. Today was no exception. He grabbed the absurd parking tickets off the windshield and crumpled them into a ball in his fist. Then he dropped the wad of paper onto the oil-stained concrete floor. "I have diplomatic immunity," he said aloud, and smiled as he climbed into his Jag. Schaefer couldn't believe it. He had made a very serious and perhaps irreversible mistake. The result wasn't what he had expected, and now his whole world seemed to be falling apart. At times he thought it couldn't have been any worse had he gone to prison for the cold-blooded murder of Patsy Hampton. Schaefer knew that he wasn't just being paranoid or mad. Several of the pathetic wankers inside the embassy watched him every bloody time he stepped out of his office. They seemed to resent and openly despise him, especially the women. Who had turned them against him? Somebody surely was responsible. He was the white English O.J. Simpson, a weird off-color joke to them.